For my final project, I chose to imagine what funerals would be like for Disney princesses. Like we learned in class, death is shown or implied more in kids' movies than in adult movies. So what would it be like for these beloved characters if they passed away? Let's start with Mulan. In northern Wei Dynasty China, the deceased were buried in tombs with three parts: the ramp down into the ground, the passageway into the burial room, and the burial room itself. In the burial room was the wooden coffin with the body. The location of the tombs relative to each other shows the relationships the deceased had with each other. Family cemeteries and clusters of tombs showed the strong clan relationships of that time. There were also joint burials, where two or more people would be buried together. There might have even been secondary burials to put families closer together or have joint burials after one person had already been buried. The contents of the tomb were extremely important. Death was seen as a continuation of life, so the family would have to anticipate what the deceased would need. There would be miniature replications of objects important to the dead person called mingqi, which means spirit goods. Mingqi would also include human-faced guardian animals called zhenmu shao, as well as other animals, military figures, representations of music, and more. Sacrifices were also important to put in the tomb, which included items to connect the living and the dead and symbols of fortune. The rich were often buried with expensive metals and jewels, but the poor were buried with items that were more meaningful or symbolic to the family than expensive. There were also murals on the walls of the tomb that showed important scenes to the person or the family, and often included stories of filial piety. Northern Wei Dynasty China was influenced heavily by three main belief systems: Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. Taoism has the perspective of death as part of the natural balance of the world, but emphasizes the importance of trying to avoid it by taking good care of your body. Buddhism emphasizes self-actualization and includes the belief of reincarnation. Confucianism is the religion most obviously depicted in Mulan. Confucianism places a high importance on filial piety and responsibilities in the family, as well as worshiping your ancestors. The movie depicts Mulan's father praying to their ancestors multiple times, and the spirits of the ancestors are involved in the plot. Confucianism is intertwined heavily in a lot of the mourning rituals. The mourning period can last from 3 months to 3 years, depending on how close you were to the person and their age. Children were expected to take great care of their parents when they got old and ensure their proper burial and transition into the afterworld. Burial rituals like burning symbolic paper money and lighting candles during the ceremony were very important. Annual visits to the tomb to show respect and that the person was missed were expected. Next is Tiana. Her movie was set in the 1920s in New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans is known to this day for their jazz funerals, which were originally just called funerals with music. They were also mainly for musicians or prominent community members, but nowadays anyone can organize one. There are 2 parts to the jazz funeral procession. The first line consists of the family, friends, funeral directors, and all the brass jazz band. The second line is the crowd of people marching behind them. A jazz funeral has a specific order. First, there is a wake, and then the procession goes together to the church for the funeral service. After the service, they go to the cemetery, with the jazz band in the front playing funeral dirges. When the person is laid to rest, that is called cutting the body loose. After that, the procession becomes a celebration of life. Loud, joyous music is played, and people dance and sing. Anyone around can join in as long as they march behind the second line. The origins of jazz funerals come from West African traditions and voodoo beliefs that combined with some aspects of Christianity, specifically Catholicism, which was the dominant religion in the area. Under the Black Code in Louisiana, slaves were allowed to gather to participate in Christian worship and for their own Christian burials. Because these were the only times enslaved peoples could be together, funeral rituals became really important to feel connected to each other. Jazz music originated from the traditional West African drum music that slaves sung and danced to during the few gatherings they were allowed to have. Jazz funerals became a way to honor the dead without conforming to the Eurocentric ideals of expensive memorials and monuments that only the wealthy could afford. The celebration of life aspect from the second part of the funeral comes from West African and voodoo beliefs that a celebration will make the spirits who protect the dead happy. Another unique aspect of burial in New Orleans is the mausoleum. In the 1700s, specifically the 1720s to 80s, bodies were buried underground. However, New Orleans is below sea level and is therefore very susceptible to floods, so graves would be washed away. Architects came from France who had inspiration from above-ground cemeteries in Paris, which was exactly what New Orleans needed. The next princess is Merida from Brave. By the 10th century, Scotland was Christianized, but there was a lot of influence from other areas as well. Different Celtic groups, Ireland, Germanic influences, and Norse culture all contributed to the traditions of Scotland. All of that, plus Scottish folklore, influenced how people saw death during that time, and traditions varied from region to region depending on how much of each culture was prevalent in that area. A lot of death rituals had to do with worrying about the spirits of the deceased becoming restless dead and bringing bad luck and troubles to the family. After a person died, the windows were immediately opened, clocks were stopped, and mirrors were covered with white linen, all to avoid bad luck and make sure the spirit would move on. The deceased body was laid out on a board called a striking bier and covered with a winding sheet, somewhat similar to a burial shroud. An 8-day vigil was held where there was one relative and one stranger watching over the body at all times. The vigil was called sitting when the sun was up and like-wake after the sun went down. During it, people would gather around the coffin for dancing, singing, eating, joking, and getting really drunk together. When they played cards after getting drunk, sometimes the coffin was even used as the card table. After about 8 days, they would take off the winding sheet and dress the body in special funeral clothes. 2 chairs were placed in front of the door and the coffin was placed on them. After the coffin was picked up to start the journey to the cemetery, the 2 chairs had to be knocked over. They would only be picked up after sunset and after being washed, otherwise the spirit might return. Along the way to the cemetery, there were rest-in stands, which were places where people could put the coffin down and take a break. They would drink whiskey the whole time and get very drunk. After the coffin was buried, they would have a celebration near the grave. These hogback stones were Norse grave markers introduced into the area by Vikings. They would be placed over top of the grave and resembled Norse houses of the dead. These were seen only in places that were influenced a lot by the Vikings. 2 specific pieces of the folklore I wanted to point out were the importance of bees and will-o'-the-wisps. Bees, beekeeping, and beehives have been really important in Scotland for a long time. After a person died, the family had to tell the bees about the death. The bees were seen as a link between the physical world and the spiritual world, and it was believed that there would be another death if no one whispered the news of the death to the bees. Will-o'-the-wisps, in Scottish folklore, were spirits of the dead that led travelers away from where they were supposed to go, potentially into dangerous situations. Wisps were really important in the movie, but they were portrayed overall as more of a good thing, and were supposed to lead you to your fate. The next princess is Rapunzel from Tangled, which takes place in 19th century Germany. German funerals were intertwined with Christianity quite a bit. The dead would be buried in churchyards. In getting ready for the burial, there was no viewing or embalming of the body. Instead, neighbors, friends, or family members washed and dressed the body. Given Rapunzel's socioeconomic status as a princess, she would have had a very nice coffin and tombstone, and maybe even be in a family mausoleum if that was something her family had. Some people at that time were unable to afford much more than a simple cross as a grave marker. At the actual funeral, dark colors, particularly black, were expected for the clothing. The mood at the funeral was very solemn, and little to no emotions were shown. The burial was seen by some as a movement into the afterlife, so there might have been some hope in the mourners as well. The ceremonies during this time varied a lot in terms of how elaborate they were, from class of 1 to class of 5, with class of 1 being the highest. People were somewhere in that scale depending on their social status and how much they could afford. A first-class funeral procession had a funeral carriage with 2 horses and 2 men leading it. Behind that, 12 men accompanied the coffin and 10 assistants were there to fill the grave. Some lesser processions had 8 men for the coffin and 8 assistants. At the church, the ceremony would start with prayers and hymns, then friends and family giving speeches, and then a final blessing before the procession moved to the graveyard. A Leichin Prede was held by the grave. A Leichin Prede is a funeral sermon that praises the deceased and their accomplishments. No one was allowed to say anything negative about the person, and sometimes the Leichin Prede would be inaccurate or embellished to make the person seem better. Depending on the socio-economic status of the family, sometimes the Leichin Prede was printed out and given to everyone. After the funeral, the family and friends gathered for Leichenschmaus, which literally means corpse feast. It was a chance for everyone to share memories and good times they had with the deceased. They served traditional German foods and the Zuckerkuchen funeral cakes. Personal grief was often repressed. They distinguished forms of mourning that affected the signs others saw of how the death impacted the person specifically. Tiefe Trauer means deep mourning, and Stille Trauer means silent mourning. Another important aspect of death was the mourning attire. Widows were expected to wear black clothing for 1 to 5 years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Parents, in-laws, and children wore black for 1 year, and grandchildren wore black for 6 months. The last person is Pocahontas. This is the only character who was a real person. However, as we all know, Disney's representation of her life was far from the truth. For example, this is a picture of what she most likely looked at as a child, then as a teenager. And because Pocahontas was a real person, she had a real death. She died on a boat returning to Virginia pretty soon after it departed. She was buried in England at St. George's Church when she was about 21. One of the saddest parts is that we have no idea where her grave is, because the church burned down and a bunch of graves around it were cleared out. It is unclear if the new church was constructed right where the other one stood, or if it was somewhere else on the property. No one knows where she was buried, or even if her remains are still there. There is only a statue on the property in her honor. So I'm going to imagine the burial she should have been able to have. Unfortunately, due to colonization, so much culture from the Powhatan Confederacy was lost, and all that is left of their practices comes from written English accounts from colonizers, some archaeology, and traditions of other Native Americans back then and today. Researchers have been able to put together an idea of what their burial practices were like. There is still a lot of uncertainty about beliefs, though. Some researchers think that only shamans and chiefs expected an afterlife, and others say that everyone expected an afterlife. Some say it was believed that there were 2 afterworlds, one for good and one for bad. There is more consensus on the actual burial practices. These are 3 common burial practices there seems to be agreement on. The first one is more of what Americans today would consider a traditional burial. Shallow graves were dug with sharpened sticks. They put jewelry on the deceased and wrapped them in animal skins before placing them in the grave, maybe with some important belongings. These graves were for common people and scattered all over. If there were any grave markers, they have either been destroyed or decayed over time. As for cremation, it was used to kill criminals and sometimes prisoners of war, but it's unclear if any others were cremated as well. As for scaffold burials, these were not exclusive to the Powhatans. In this kind of burial, the deceased was disemboweled, wrapped in animal skins, and placed on a wooden scaffold. They were left for about 2 or 3 years until only bones were left. If there was still some flesh, the bones would be cleaned and dried. After that, they were wrapped in new animal skins and kept in the home of the family. Every few years, a festival would take place where the bones were taken and buried, and over the years, a burial mound would form. The final method of burial was used only for chiefs and maybe other noteworthy people. Because of the importance of Pocahontas in the Powhatan Confederacy, she might have received this kind of burial. If not this method, it would be the scaffold burial. This method is mummification. The body would be cut down the back and the bones would be taken out, cleaned and dried, and then replaced, with sand also put in the body to fill it up. Then their back would be sewn up and the body would be oiled. Any flesh taken off the bones would be sewn into a basket that would be placed with the body. It is said that the mummified body looked very lifelike. The body would be put on a scaffold and likely guarded by idols. After that, the official mourning process began. The family, if wealthy, might throw beads to poorer people and host a feast. Women would paint their faces black and wail in their homes. The places the chiefs were displayed after death were called quioccations, or ossuary temples. I'm not sure if Pocahontas would have received this burial had she died in Virginia with her family, as it was reserved mostly for chiefs, but she most likely would have received either this burial or the scaffold burial. Thank you for listening to my whole presentation. I included my sources at the end of the slideshow, color-coded by Princess, if you want to know more.